Federal Democratic Republic of Nepal, usually referred to as just Nepal, is a country located in the Himalayas that is bordered in the northeast by China and is otherwise surrounded by India, including in the east, where there is a narrow sliver of India separating Nepal from Bhutan and Bangladesh. So Nepal is mostly mountainous, it's landlocked, and it's right in between two burgeoning regional powers who are also increasingly, in many ways, global powers. Its capital is Kathmandu, and there are a little over 31 million people in the country as of 2024. More than 80% of them are Hindu, and the country's landmass spans about 57,000 square miles, or 147.5 square kilometers, which is a little smaller than the US state of Illinois, and almost exactly the same size as Bangladesh. Modern Nepal came about beginning in the mid-20th century, when the then-ruling Rana autocracy was overthrown in the wake of neighboring India's independence movement, and a parliamentary democracy replaced it. But there was still a king, and he did not like sharing power with the rest of the government, so he did away with the democracy component of the government in 1960, making himself the absolute monarch and banning all political activities, which also necessitated jailing politicians, in his mind. The country was modernized during this period in the sense of building out infrastructure and such, but it was pulled backwards in many ways culturally, as there wasn't much in the way of individual liberties for civilians, and everything was heavily censored by the king and his people. In 1990, a multi-party movement called the People's Movement forced the king, this one ascended to the throne in 1972, to adopt a constitution and allow a multi-party democracy in Nepal. One of the parties that decided to enter the local political fray around this time, the Maoist Party, started violently trying to shift the country in another direction, though, intending to replace its parliamentary system with a people's republic, similar to what was happening in China and the Soviet Union. This sparked a civil war that led to a whole lot of deaths, including those of the king and the crown prince. The now-dead king's brother stepped in, gave himself a bunch of new powers, and then tried to stomp the Maoist Party into submission. But there was a peaceful democratic revolution in the country in 2006, at which point the Maoists put down their arms and became a normal, non-violent political party. Nepal then became a secular state, after being a Hindu kingdom for most of their modern history, and a few years later they became a federal republic. It took a little while, and there was quite a bit of tumult in the meantime, but eventually in 2015, the Nepalese government got a new constitution that divided the country into 7 provinces and made Nepal a federal democratic republic. What I'd like to talk about today is what has happened in the past decade in Nepal and how those happenings led to a recent, seemingly pretty successful series of protests. You're listening to Let's Know Things. I'm Colin Wright. I'm able to keep this show ad-free because of support from listeners like you. If you're finding value in what I'm doing here, consider becoming a paid supporter for the cost of a cup of coffee each month at letsknowthings.com. And as a thank you for your helping me keep this show solvent, you'll receive an additional bonus More Things episode each month. All right, let's get back to the show. In early 2025, from March through early June, a series of protests were held across Nepal by pro-monarchy citizens and the local pro-monarchy party, initially in response to the former king's visit to the country, but later to basically just show discontent with the current government. These protests were at least partly politically motivated, in the sense of being planned and fanned into larger conflagrations by that pro-monarchy party, not truly a grassroots series of events. But they grew and grew, partly on the strength of opposition to the police response, which was quite violent, to earlier protests. That same distaste carried through the year into September of 2025, when the Nepalese government announced a ban on 26 social media platforms, including Facebook, Instagram, Reddit, and YouTube, because the companies behind these platforms ostensibly failed to register under the Ministry of Communication and Information Technology's new rules that required, among other things, that they have local liaisons that the government could meet with in person and complain to if a given network failed to remove something they did not like quickly enough. The general sense about that ban is that while this failure to properly register was used as justification for shutting down these networks, which are incredibly popular in the country, the real reason the government wanted to shut them down at that moment was that a trend had emerged on these social networks in which the rich and powerful in Nepal, and especially their children, many of whom have become online influencers, were being criticized for their immense opulence and for bragging about their family's vast wealth, while everyone else was comparably poor and suffering. This became known as the Nepo baby or Nepo kid trend, hashtag Nepo baby, which was a tag borrowed from Indonesia. And the general idea is that taxpayer money is being siphoned to enrich a few powerful families at the expense of everyone else. And the kids of these powerful families were basically just bragging about this in public spaces, not even bothering to hide their family's misdeeds and corruption. Completely shameless. This, perhaps understandably, led to a lot more discontent, and all that simmering anger led to online outcries. And the government tried to stifle these outcries by shutting down these networks in the country. But the shutdown, as is often the case in these sorts of situations, led to in-person protests, which started out as peaceful demonstrations in Kathmandu and surrounding areas, but eventually became violent when the police started firing tear gas and rubber bullets at the crowds, causing 19 deaths and hundreds of injuries. The ban was implemented on September 4th and then lifted after the initial protests on September 8th. But the government's response seems to have made this a much bigger thing than it initially was, and maybe bigger than it would have ever become sans that police response. It's worth mentioning here, too, that a lot of young people in Nepal rely on social media and messaging apps like Signal, which was also banned, for their livelihood, both for social media-related work and for various sorts of remittances, bringing money into the country from other countries. And that, combined with an existing 20% youth unemployment rate, 1 in every 5 young people in the country not able to find a job, meant that young people were very riled up and unhappy with the state of things already, and this ban just poured fuel on that flame. On that same note, the median age in Nepal is 25. It's a pretty young country, so there are a lot of Gen Zers in Nepal. They are the generation that uses social media the most, and because they rely so heavily on these networks to stay in touch with each other and the world, this ban triggered a mass outpouring of anger, and that led to huge protests in a very short time. These protests grew in scope, eventually leading to the burning of government buildings. The military was called in to help bring order, and ultimately the Home Minister and then the Prime Minister on September 8th and 9th, respectively, resigned. A lot of the burning of government buildings happened after those resignations. Protesters eventually burned the homes of government ministers and the residences of the Prime Minister and President as well. All people who either were responsible or thought to be responsible for all that corruption, or who had children who were bragging about how their families were corrupt as hell and taking all this money. The protesters did not have any formal leadership, though there were attempts during the protests by local pro-monarchy parties and representatives to position these protests as being pro-king, something that most protesters have said is not the case, but you can see why that might have worked for them considering those pro-monarchy protests earlier this year. That said, by September 10th, the military was patrolling most major cities, and on the 11th, the president, head general, and Gen Z representatives for the protesters met to select an interim leader. They ended up using Discord, a chat app often used by gamers, to vote on a former Supreme Court Justice, Sushila Karki, as the interim prime minister, and the first woman to be prime minister in Nepalese history. Parliament was then dissolved, and March 5th was set as the date for the next election. Karki has said she will remain in office for no more than 6 months. As of September 13th, all curfews had been lifted across Nepal, the prime minister was visiting injured protesters in hospitals, and relative calm had returned, though at least 72 people are said to have been killed during the protests, and more than 2,000 were injured. There are currently calls for unity from across the political spectrum in Nepal, with everyone seeming to see the writing on the wall at this point that the youths have shown their strength, and there's a fresh need to toe the line that's been established, lest the existing parties and power structures be completely toppled. There is a chance that this newfound unity against government overreach and censorship will hold, though it's important to note that the folks who were allegedly siphoning all these resources for their families were able to escape the country, most without harm, due to assistance from police and the military, and that means they could still influence things, either from exile or after quietly returning to Nepal in the lead up to that March election. It's also possible that the major parties will do more to favor the huge Gen Z population in Nepal from this point forward, which could result in less unemployment and freer speech. Though if the king and the pro-monarchy party is able to continue insinuating themselves into these sorts of conversations, positioning themselves as an alternative to the nepotism and corruption that many people in the area have reasonably come to associate with this type of democracy, there could be a resurgent effort to bring the monarchy back by those who have already seen some success in this regard quite recently. The book I'd like to recommend today is called Super Agency: What Could Possibly Go Right with Our AI Future by Reid Hoffman and Greg Beto. This is a valuable book, I think, because it provides a counterpoint to the many books and other writings that have been published on all the things that could go wrong and seem to already be going wrong as a result of the deployment of generative AI tools across society. And this book does come from a place of bias. Reid Hoffman is the co-founder of LinkedIn. He is a huge tech enthusiast, and he is somebody who looks at the world from a very particular point of view as a consequence. But I still think it's valuable to understand what the best arguments are from all sides of any conversation. And because this is something that is still being sorted out, the shakeup that resulted from the development and deployment of these sorts of tools, that's still being sorted out. We're still seeing the repercussions of this, and that will probably be the case for many years into the future. So it's a good idea to understand the things that could go right alongside the things that could go wrong, so that ideally we benefit as much as possible from any new tool and any new shakeup, just as much as we try to avoid the potential negative downsides of these things. Now, if any of that sounds interesting to you, consider picking up a copy of Super Agency by Reid Hoffman and Greg Beto. Let's Know Things is a listener-supported show. I don't make any money from ads, only what listeners contribute by becoming paid supporters at letsknowthings.com. If you're not in the position to become a paid supporter at the moment, consider leaving a quick review wherever you get your pods. Those help get the show in front of more people and lend a hint of credibility to independently made shows like this one. A huge thanks in advance, whatever shape your support might take.